Christ is risen. Bright Week has been quite a time to be following the news. An American Pope stood up to an American president, and whatever you make of the politics, something in that image caught the moral imagination of the entire world. Pope Leo spoke about war and the dignity of migrants, and the president called him weak and terrible at foreign policy. And then, predictably, people began to reach for a familiar frame. The church has its lane, the state has its lane, and religious leaders ought to stay in theirs. Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. The Pope, some said, should mind his own business. It's worth pausing for a moment on that reflex because it tells us something important, and not just about this current moment. When people reach for that passage from the Gospels, they tend to read it as a kind of tidy settlement, a kind of constitutional arrangement in which Jesus parcels out sovereignty between two domains. Caesar gets the earthly zone, God gets the spiritual zone. Everyone stays in their own lane. But that misses the entire point of what Jesus was doing. The question put to him was a trap, a calculated attempt to make him either a Roman collaborator or a Jewish insurgent, depending on his answer. And he answered it as the trap that it was. He asked for a coin. Whose image is on it? Caesar's. Very well, give Caesar back his coin. The word Jesus uses is actually closer to give back than simply give. Return it to him. Now set that alongside the words of Jesus in the gospel we heard at that first Paschal vigil a week ago from Matthew 28. Words we heard again at last night's vigil in the gospel. All power in heaven and on earth have been given to me. Or consider Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and all that is in it, the world and those who dwell therein. Everything belongs to God, all of it without remainder. The question is not which domain Caesar governs, but what image anything bears. The coin bears Caesar's image, and Caesar is welcome to it. But everything else bears the image of God and belongs to him. The passage does not sanctify Caesar, it radically relativizes him. It does not establish a Caesarian zone. It narrows Caesar's claim to the vanishing point of a coin. There is no neat two-column accounting here. There is only God's world in which Caesar occupies a temporary and subordinate position. Now I want to suggest to you this morning that we've made exactly the same misreading with the passage we just heard from the Gospel of John. And that unpicking this is the work of this Sunday. It's the evening of the first day of the week, and the disciples are behind locked doors. John tells us why. They were afraid. Now hold that image for a moment. Locked doors are fear's own architecture. You build them when the world outside has become a place of danger, when you've run out of courage to remain in it. These are the people who fled, who denied, who hid. Peter denied Jesus 3 times at a charcoal fire. The others scattered when the soldiers came. And now they've gathered in a room and locked the world out. Into this room, into this monument to fear and failure, the risen Christ comes. And notice what he doesn't do. He doesn't address the locked doors. He doesn't stand before them as a demonstration of power over barriers, as if the point were to impress them with his ability to walk through walls. The locked doors are simply irrelevant to the Paschal body. He passes through them the way light passes through glass. And he's simply there, present to people who thought they'd lost him and who had in various ways betrayed him. And his first word is peace. And then in case you missed it, he says it again, peace. Not where were you, or I needed you and you weren't there. Not a reckoning, not a reproach, just peace, given twice to people who had earned neither instance of it. St. Peter Chrysologus, the 5th century bishop of Ravenna, notes this repetition and sees in this tremendous pastoral wisdom. Christ knows the struggles that will come among them, the comparisons and the guilt, and so he gives them his peace repeatedly to each of them and to all of them together. Without this forgiveness, Chrysologus says, even Peter would have been found unworthy of his subsequent calling. Then Jesus shows them his hands and his side. The wounds are the credentials of the forgiveness being offered. They say, I know what this cost. I bore it. And from this body, from these wounds, from this flesh that has been broken and has passed through death and gone down to hell, Jesus now breathes. The Greek verb John uses here is enephesisen. It's a rare word, and John uses it deliberately because it's the same word the Septuagint uses in Genesis chapter 2, when God breathes into the nostrils of the mud creature, the man. He's formed from dust, and the man becomes a living being. John wants us to hear that echo. This is a new creation moment. The spirit of the resurrection is the breath of the new Adam, and its first and constitutive act, the thing that defines it, the thing it is given to breathe, is forgiveness. St. John Chrysostom observes this carefully and distinguishes between what was given in this breath and what was then given at Pentecost with the outpouring of the Spirit. He says the gifts of Pentecost were broader, the working of miracles, the tongues of fire, the power to be witnesses to the ends of the earth. But what was given in this breath, in this upper room, from the wounded side of the risen Christ, in this locked room to these frightened and forgiven disciples, was specifically and characteristically the power to remit sins. The Spirit breathed from the wounds is in its essence the spirit of forgiveness. So now we come to the verse that has been, I think, misread as often as render unto Caesar, and in much the same way. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. We tend to hear this as a grant of two equal and coordinate authorities, a kind of balanced charter, a spiritual jurisprudence that gives the church power to include some and to exclude others. Forgive or retain. Two options, equally valid, equally sanctioned by Christ. The church, on this reading, has been given a great power to decide who is in and who is out. But look again at the scene in which these words are spoken. The Spirit is being given to a room full of people who deserved reproach and received peace. The wounds that credential this moment are the wounds of the one who chose forgiveness over condemnation when he had every right to choose otherwise. The context is the commentary. Christ is not handing out a balanced charter of inclusion and exclusion. He's breathing his peace into a room that had no claim on it. That's the gift, and that's its purpose. The false symmetry here is the same false symmetry of the Caesar verse. Just as that passage does not establish a Caesarean zone, this passage does not establish condemnation as an equal and legitimate program for the church. What the mention of retaining sins names is simply a pastoral reality, not a punitive option. Forgiveness is not automatic. It's not magic. It requires encounter and engagement. And there are, of course, situations that have not yet resolved into the fullness of what the Spirit is pressing towards. Those situations exist, and the words spoken acknowledge them. But retention is always provisional. It's a description of where something is, never a verdict on what must remain. The telos always is is forgiveness. St. Ambrose of Milan saw this clearly because he was arguing against people who had got it precisely wrong. His 4th century opponents were the Novatianists, that group that refused to forgive serious sins committed after baptism. Their argument was presented all too piously. Only God can truly forgive such things. The church should not presume to act in his place. Ambrose replied that they had fundamentally misunderstood the gift. The authority to bind and the authority to loose are not two separate grants. They are one gift, unified and undivided. A community that refuses to forgive sins has not elevated itself to some kind of higher moral standard. It has disqualified itself from the gift entirely. You cannot claim the power to retain without the power to release, because they are the same power. St. Ambrose decries as heresy the view that retention is the primary or defining, proudest exercise of what the Spirit bestows. That same view has been revived in the contemporary church under the guise of traditionalism. But it's the same judgmental, exclusionary, and punitive retention of sins that St. Ambrose faced off against in the Novatians. You can dress that view up on a fancy website and call it Orthodox ethos and put out endless YouTube videos, but it's not truth, it's not rigor, it's not Orthodox Christianity. It's a distortion of the gift of the Spirit. And so we come to the Apostle Thomas. We've been calling him the Doubting Thomas for so long that the name the church actually gives him this morning can feel almost ironic. The church commemorates him as Thomas the Believing, Thomas the Missionary, Thomas who went further than almost any of the others, who carried the gospel to India and died for it. But on the evening of that first day, he wasn't there. He was absent from the room when the risen Christ came and breathed his peace. We're not told why or where he was. We only know he missed it. And then when the others told him what had happened, he could not receive it. He held out. He set conditions. Unless I see the marks of the nails, unless I put my finger in the wounds, I won't believe. He had, in a sense, retained himself from the community's experience of the risen Lord. He could not open the door from the inside. What does Jesus do? He comes back. A week later, he's there again, and this time Thomas is in the room. And Jesus does not say that Thomas had his chance. He doesn't treat Thomas's absence as a forfeiture or a failure, his doubt as a disqualification. He returns and offers those same wounds again, the same wounds he showed the others, the same credentials of forgiveness, the same invitation to touch and believe. Thomas's retention was not a verdict. It was simply a condition that the risen Christ chose to re-enter. The man we commemorate today as the Believing was the one who most needed that second coming. He was the one for whom the Spirit of forgiveness had to go back. He's the proof that when this gospel speaks of retaining sins, it does not mean here's the door that stays permanently locked. It means here's a situation that remains, that is not yet ready to resolve, that the risen Christ will surely come back to it. The Spirit given to forgive sins is the Spirit that went back for Thomas. And on this Sunday, we commemorate his response, when he finally opens his hands and says, "My Lord and my God." And we witness his testimony to the risen Christ, who moves through every barrier we have ever built against him and offers again and still the peace that passes all understanding. We too have been given the spirit of forgiveness, not the spirit of the locked room, not the spirit of two-column accounting, not the spirit of the Novatianists who took the power to bind and forgot the power to loose. The Spirit breathed from the wounds of the new Adam, whose first and defining act was to fill a room filled with frightened, failing people with peace. The question the gospel puts to us is the same question it put to Thomas. Will we actually receive it? Will we let the risen Christ come back Come through the doors that we have locked. Come to the places in ourselves that have retained themselves from his mercy. And having received it, will we breathe it outward, the way he breathed it into us, toward every Thomas in our lives who needs that second coming. Jesus does not say Thomas had his chance. He came back, and he always comes. Amen. Christ is risen.
He is risen.